So I will be arguing that character should be in the curriculum. I think this is a step forward from the last time I was involved in one of these debates, which was titled Character Education is a Waste of Time. So it feels like some progress has been made. I'd like to start with a quick definition of what I mean by character, get to the root of what I think the issue we're talking about here, just a little bit about the importance of character and how it sort of fits into my vision of education, and then some specifics of character in the curriculum, because I am managing director of a charity called Floreat Education, which runs 2 primary free schools, 3 more opening, and we take what we call a knowledge and virtue approach, so a knowledge-rich academic curriculum, but an explicit and purposeful attempt to develop pupils' character in every moment of school life. So first of all, just on the definition, by character what I mean is a set of virtues which have specific meaning and ethical content. So what I mean by that is it's possible to gain an increasingly sophisticated understanding of what these terms mean. It is very different to personality. It is not just a set of sort of inherited dispositions that you can't do a lot about. It is a set of latencies that you can, to some extent, not wholly, but to some extent develop. And the comparison I'd like you to hold in your mind is the difference between having a raw IQ and the extent to which someone is educated. One will clearly influence the other, not least the speed perhaps and certain domains in which you can do it, but they are different. And that's what we're talking about with character. And James Heckman, who will be familiar to lots of you, I'm sure, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has demonstrated through his research, most recent research in the early years, that character is malleable to some extent. Now, to what extent is obviously a topic for discussion and research, but it is malleable to some extent, and that is critical because that gets to the heart of not only, I think, why character should be a part of school life, which actually I know it is from, in the best schools, but specifically within the curriculum. Now, look, every good story needs a bad guy, and I think the bad guy in this is not Joe Kirby, much as I would like it to be, but is actually Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his idea of the noble savage, which is this romantic notion that man can only be free when stripped, or woman, he didn't put it in those terms then, of course, can only be free once he's stripped of oppressive, human-created culture. And this is as true, by the way, of knowledge, of the intellectual, if you like, as it is of the character, the sort of moral purpose of people. And so in this context, civilization culture is characterized as paternalistic and oppressive. But for me, this is a completely wrong, 180-degree wrong understanding of what it is to be free. And that we now understand that actually if humans were completely stripped of everything that makes us tick, every aspect of our culture, that we are barely more sophisticated than the apes. Matt Ridley, in his book Rational Optimist, talks about civilization being the software that runs on the hardware of our brains. And if you take the software away, all you're left is with the hardware, and it is not that different to chimps and baboons and so on. So it is not the case that we can just simply be free, the idea of the noble savage. And therefore, the most profound thing that education can do is pass on the accumulated wisdom of how to think and also how to live well. If you like, sort of factual truths about the world and ethical truths of how to have a purposeful and flourishing life in society. And this might be conceived as the classical view of education. It's not just a Western thought, by the way, and this is important too, so we don't get too parochial. This is very much the feature of Confucian thinking as well in the East. And I think it's quite well summed up in the British context with the view of 2 Arnolds, Matthew and Thomas. Matthew, of course, talked about pupils learning the best that has been thought of said, an idea that lies at the heart of everything that happens at Michaela, and indeed Floreat too in our academic education. But his father, I think it was, or was it his son? Anyway, whatever it was, they're related, who ran Rugby School, talked about the educational ideal of noble character. And it's these 2 things together, the exercise of the mind and the morals, that for me make up what a proper education is. So I think I've talked about here two sort of visions of education, if you like. One is that only by stripping away the accretions of civilization. What does that mean, by the way?
Halfway.
Oh, thank you. That's probably about okay. Can we be free? So the progressive idea, if you like, whereas the more traditional idea is that only by passing on that accumulated wisdom can we be free. It seems to me that lots of the arguments from philosophy, from cognitive science, psychology and so on are in favour of the traditional view. But what the traditionalists are very poor at, I think, and I wasn't here unfortunately this morning, but following it on Twitter, is defining why their method is better. And Daisy, I think, from what I understand of what she talked about, did a really good job of talking about it, which is not about the end of education, but is about the means, how we get there. Because it's not simply to create in the words of Radiohead, people who are fitter, happier, and more productive. It is to create people with that ability to think critically and independence of thought that means that they can constantly challenge accepted dogma in the search for truth. So this is what Aristotle called phronesis. And if this is at the heart of education, it does have these two halves, as I say. It does have the academic, the intellectual about the mind, and it does have the moral purpose as well. And I'd just be interested, if we've got time for a quick show of hands, whether anybody thinks that it is not the role of schools to morally develop their students' pupils. Could we just have a show of hands? Does anyone think it's not the role of schools? Okay, so there's a couple over there, very deeply immoral people. And so the question then is, I think, about how. Dan Wright, who's a teacher who's written for the Jubilee Centre, talks about a taught course in character being as to the process of character education as grammar is to learning English. I think it's a bit more than that. This is actually about learning about the subject. So how do you say to a child, thank you for being for showing dignity, or please can you show forgiveness, if those children don't understand the meaning of the word? So the first idea here is about meaning and understanding. It's the same as teaching biology. A child might come into our school in reception knowing some of the body parts, but they don't know how they fit together, they don't know how they work, and they don't know how it fits in with an overall vision of the human body. So we have a virtue literacy program whereby across 18 two-week modules, children learn about a set of virtues. They learn about these concepts, the synonyms, antonyms, and so on, through stories, myths, moral exemplars, and so on. What this also helps to create, as well as understanding, is a language, and that helps to create a school culture. I think it's true that many teachers in secular schools lack that language for moral development and a lack of framework, and is not something that is encouraged in initial teacher training. So it creates permission for this to be a purpose of the school. It creates, as I said, the ability to communicate with children about the idea of moral education. And in our case, we also do something called service learning, which is the sort of behavioural side. So if virtue literacy, learning about the things is cognitive, then doing the behavioural side we do through service learning, which is projects which support the community. What this looks like in practice at Floreat, well, if you've never met any 4-year-olds, and when they come into reception, you'll know that they're absolutely all over the place. So the first thing that we teach them, the first module, is self-control. And as I said, we learn about what that means, we learn about the opposites, we learn about alternative words for it. We talk about why it matters for you, why it can help you get control, why it matters for others, but to provide that calm environment in which we can learn. And it provides key languages and actions. So the one that we've developed for self-control is pause. And we have a little symbol for it, which is press the pause button. And what this means is there's now an opportunity for at any moment, at any point of school life, in any point in that child's school career, if something's going wrong, the teacher can do that, or they can even start to do it themselves and pause. And that gives you the ability to do something which we would have struggled to have done, building a culture from scratch, which is to create, as I say, that way of communicating how to develop morally. And it is already showing itself in the way that children behave at things like lunchtime and how they talk to their parents and so on. So that is what we are doing at Floreat. And there are other talk courses around as well, and we'll start to see, I think, them develop. But this is a very early and quite sort of emergent programme. But we definitely see it working, and I think the case for doing it is strong. I just want to quickly deal with what I think is probably the strongest argument against doing this, which is the classic opportunity cost argument. Instead of doing this, you could be doing something else, maths, English, science, humanities, whatever it is. But ours is mainly a virtue literacy programme, so it has the added benefit of expanding children's vocabularies, deepening their meaning, and it has those knock-on benefits into the other aspects of school life. And that goes to the heart of what we try to do, which is to make, the phrase we use is to make every moment of the day work harder, so that it has its academic purpose and its moral purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And now to speak, well, not against the idea of character, but about the idea of character in the curriculum? Jo Kirby, thank you.
So I think there's a lot of areas that we converge on, but some also divergent ways of thinking. I think what we agree on is that we're passionate about helping our pupils improve who they are. And I think as teachers we know that there are limitless opportunities in throughout the school day to make that happen. Where I think we disagree is on the how. Lord O'Shaughnessy would have you believe that we should timetable character into the school curriculum. I disagree. I think we should embed character into the school culture. So what's at stake in this debate? Well, for a start, there are £5 million because the government's just funded £5 million worth of character programmes focused mainly on resilience and grit. And I think we need to ask ourselves, is that £5 million well spent? Should we spend it again or should we scale back that funding? But I think it's more than about just the money. I think it's also, this debate is a battle for the soul of schools. Should the 500 new free schools that are setting up, should they put character into their curriculum? Should the 25,000 existing schools put character into their curriculum in the timetable and timetable it every week, or have a virtue literacy programme of 18 modules, 2-week modules? My answer would be a resounding no, and here's why. There are 3 charges today that I want to bring against the character curriculum. For a start, it's unworkable. Secondly, it's undesirable. And thirdly, it's ineffective. It's unworkable because, for a start, there's no body of knowledge. It's not like subjects like English, where there's 3,000 years worth of literature to read. It's not like subjects like history, where there's millennia of recorded history and artifacts and objects before it. It's not like subjects like science and maths, where there's an evolving and enduring body of knowledge, an object of study to actually get to grips with, that's developed over the millennia. Instead, there's no agreement on what's in and what's out. There are no boundaries to this. So you just get limitless, kind of vacuous ideas about what could constitute virtue literacy in the first place. It's also not a subject discipline. It's not like you can go away and study grit at university. It's not like any of our pupils could choose to study prudence at university. Instead, unlike subjects like history or French languages, maths, science, where you can actually go on to study this at university, it doesn't give pupils a route through a kind of passport to future success. There's also, and most fundamentally, no agreed assessment. There's no mode of assessment that we've got for working out whether pupils' characters are improving or not. One of the hardest, kind of the most nightmarish dilemmas that the character curriculum designer has in mind, and I want to take you inside that mind and kind of reveal how nightmarish those decisions are, is first of all what to select, and second of all how to assess it. And so selection is a massive problem for the character curriculum. The high priest of the character movement is Maurice Seligman, and in the States he came up with kind of 24 character traits that he thinks that we should assess. So here they are, and I'm going to read them out, and whilst I do so, I'd like you to think about how on earth you teach them throughout the course of a lesson. So here they are. Creativity, curiosity, honesty, bravery, fairness, teamwork, perseverance, perspective, leadership, love of learning, social intelligence, kindness, forgiveness, humility, judgment, gratitude, prudence, hope, humour, zest, self-regulation, spirituality. So teaching a lesson on that, imagine teaching a lesson on spirituality over a kind of 2-week period. Love, appreciation of beauty and excellence, perhaps my favourite there at the end. And you can quickly see how nebulous and how arbitrary this becomes. You know, it's almost as if you've got the whole of human experience kind of condensed into 24 bite-sized words. And I think that because it's so nebulous, it becomes incredibly hard to imagine how you actually put that into practice in a lesson. Just to kind of show you how arbitrary it is, I kind of, you know, Joe Bloggs myself came up with some other examples of what you could have chosen. And here are 20 or so others. You could have chosen amicability, assertiveness, approachability, candor, charisma, confidence, all character traits that, yeah, we find are important, but almost impossible to teach in a lesson. Conscientiousness, courage, determination, enthusiasm, integrity, modesty, motivation, passion, patience, politeness, pragmatism, responsibility, reliability, resourcefulness, stoicism, tenacity, wisdom. You know, the list goes on and on. You could probably go on for the full 10 minutes. But the point is that they're so nebulous and so arbitrary, and trying to decide on this is almost impossible to select what to teach. I remember at my last school, we had this debate. We had 8 of us come together and try and decide, out of Seligman's 24, which we were going to choose. And 8 different teachers on 8 different days came up with 8 different characteristics. And even the individual teachers themselves came up with different options on the 8 different times that we did it. So, you know, you quickly realise that there's no real agreement on what to teach. There's also no real agreement on how to assess it. And this is where it gets difficult. Do you get pupils to self-assess? Do you get parents to assess their own pupils, which quickly becomes, you know, not very reliable, not very robust? Do you get teachers to quantify? How do you quantify someone's character? I mean, hands up, is there anybody here who would like their character to be kind of quantified on a 4-point scale? You know, there are no volunteers, and there's a reason why. Because, you know, I was at an education conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was a designer, character curriculum designer, who was coming up with a few ideas, and he said, you know, we've struggled with this. How do you assess it? And we come up with 4 options, right? There are 4-point scale, and we'll start and see if you recognise this. Outstanding, good, requires improvement, and of course inadequate. And then they're struggling, it requires improvement, it's a bit tough on the kids, so maybe we should go with developing or emerging. And you just quickly begun to realise that this whole idea is spun loose from any moorings in reality, that the spurious precision that you get if you ask teachers to judge the 300 kids that they teach on a 4-point scale for 4 characteristics, which you know, Kipper boil it down to 8, and the whole of the human condition boiled down into 8 arbitrary bite-sized chunks. I think you quickly begin to realise that, you know, it's a little bit like a kind of rainbow. You know, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's you know, completely unreachable, and in reality, there's nothing there at all. I think it's also undesirable. I think it's a utopian mirage. I think it steals time from what's really important, which is subject expertise, subject knowledge. And I think that's the reason it's so important is because our kids arrive at school years behind in their vocabulary, thousands of words behind. Every minute counts, every moment counts, and powerful subject knowledge is the most liberating force for actually helping our kids to overtake some of the kids who come in with those benefits from their homes. I think that we set a really high bar at Michaela for what goes in the curriculum, and those choices are tough. There are tough choices to make. I would love, for example, in English, to be able to teach more than just a handful of the 39 Shakespeare plays. I would love for them to be able to study different civilizations, South American, Mayan civilizations, the Aztecs and the Incas. I would love them to be able to study the kind of biographies of more scientists and mathematicians. Pythagoras, for example, who was an Olympic boxer. It's an amazing story, and I would love to be able to share that with the kids, but we can't put everything in. I would love to be able to teach finance and psychology. I would love to be able to teach all of these things, but the reality is we have to make some tough choices. Powerful subject knowledge is the best way to help kids overcome initial disadvantage. Shoehorning and kind of crowbarring a lesson on prudence is not. Last of all, I've said that it's unworkable. I said that I don't think that it's particularly desirable, but most importantly, perhaps, I don't think it's effective. It won't even achieve the aims that we set out to if we did put it into a timetable lesson, because it doesn't actually change habits. I think it confuses ends and means. Yes, we do ultimately want our pupils to leave school with their characters improved, but no, we don't want to put it into the timetable. I don't think it will actually work. It's a better description. Character, I think, is a better description than it is a diagnosis of how to actually help kids improve. I think the jury's still out on the evidence. I think the EEF is reporting on certain character programs. The early indicators from the US, which have a kind of what works clearinghouse, is that out of 12 studies, only 1 program out of those 12 studies shows any difference to behaviour and academic achievement from a character program, and that was negligible. So I don't think it makes a huge difference whether we try and shoehorn it in or not. I just think I do think James is right to identify the main argument of the opportunity cost. I think we do have instead daily opportunities to help pupils with their habits, with their attendance, with their punctuality, with their homework completion and the quality of their homework. I think we can help them go from being, help them become more and more polite. I think the character curriculum is not just a mirage. I think it's a delusion. And I think it's unworkable. I think it's undesirable. I think it's ineffective. I'd say we should fight to keep character out of the curriculum.
Thank you very much, Joe. And now to rebut some of Joe's points and add some more of his own, James. Oh,
Should I get?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, look, Joe, as ever, incredibly eloquent and convincing about all things. To start with the first, sort of idea, just to some of the kind of big themes that came out. Should all schools be made to do this? God, no. I mean, I think this is an incredibly important point, and it's a sort of paradoxical point in a way, which is, I think it's possible to agree, as I think everybody in this room does by that show of hands I did, that moral development, which is a development of character, should be at the centre of education, without thinking that there should be one way that is described and prescribed by the Department for Education or anyone else for that matter about how it should be done. And one of the delicacies, in a way, in policy terms, is both saying that it matters and providing that leadership, and also having the humility to do as little about it as possible, in a way, at that kind of level, because this is something that, as in so many things, should be decided at the school level, defined at the school level, and innovation happening at the school level. So I'm not absolutely not saying that it should be in the curriculum if we're talking about a national curriculum. What I'm saying is that I think, in my vision of what education is about and how schools should run, that it should feature in our vision of how to do that. And of course, my aim would be to persuade people over time that that is something that should be there. Joe says that basically this has none of the disciplines of a real subject. I think that's an incredibly narrow and actually a very contemporary view, because there is this kind of topic called ethics, which you might have heard about, which has been around for a few thousand years, and the Greeks used to be into it, and Martin's nodding along there, and big part of the trivium and all the rest of it. The idea that education should be about helping young people to learn how to live well, which is another way of putting it, to have a good, positive life, to be positive citizens, to make a difference, to have purpose, meaning in their lives, and so on and so forth, is as old as civilization. It is only in the most recent history that we have got this desiccated view that it should be about standards only, and those standards should be defined by things that we can count. That is a really impoverished view of education. I also know it's not the view of what happens here at Michaela, or else you wouldn't be doing what you would be doing. And therefore, it's disappointing for Joe to say, oh, well, you can't assess it, therefore it doesn't have meaning. Because I thought the whole point of what we were all trying to do in free schools and trying to break out of this mould is to say that there are things that matter that cannot necessarily be assessed in the usual ways that get you through to GCSEs and the things that the department counts, right? Now, assessment is a problem for character education, or for ethics, if you like, if you see it in those narrow terms. It is impossible, really, to quantify somebody's ethical development, and any attempts to do so, I think, are doomed to failure. That does not mean that is the only way of evaluating whether somebody is developing in a certain way. And so if we agree that young people can develop better character, i.e. we can become a better version of ourselves, then it is not enough to say, oh, well, we can't count it, therefore we shouldn't bother. We need to think about what an evaluation of that looks like that is true to the topic. And for me, that means a description over time of how a child is developing in various different ways. One of the things I didn't describe in the Florida curriculum was that it's not that they, spirituality for 2 weeks. Woo, we're spiritual. Those things like the pause example, those will feature. They then go on to feature and help build that culture for moral development in school. And critically, all children, because we've only got 1 year group at the moment, but when we have 7 year groups, we'll be studying the same topic with increasing degrees of sophistication at the same time every year. So there will be lots of opportunities to come back to it. So I don't think it's just the case that because you can't count it, that means it doesn't matter. That seems to me the precise opposite way to look at what we think about education. The final point is about this sort of 24 list of virtues, the arbitrary nature of them. I mean, Joe was teaching a politician there how to filibuster, which is, I could have just got my shopping list out and just sort of stood here. But what does that mean?
1 minute.
Thank you. But that is not an arbitrary list. Martin Seligman and Chris Peterson studied over about a 5-year period every major religion and culture throughout the world, throughout history, and found 24 character virtues that were esteemed. And critical, they called them virtues, not strengths, by the way. Actually, they called them strengths and virtues. But that gives it that ethical content that cropped up time and time and time again. And this is critical because I think the purpose of education is towards finding truth. And the purpose of character education is the truth of how to live well. And because we're all humans, we may have different cultures and civilizations, but we are inching towards that truth. And those truths, it's interesting, in fact critical, that those truths reappear whenever you look throughout the world, throughout time and space. And so that is why character should be in the curriculum, because it is about accelerating that ability for children to understand the truths of how to live well. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what's happening next. Yeah.
That one.
That one.
So I'm really glad the debate's got into the how. So I think it's much more rewarding to have a debate about what works best. It's really interesting from a teacher's point of view to think about this, because there's something that James said, which is that, when you want to say to a pupil, thank you for showing dignity, hands up any teacher who's ever actually said that to a pupil, thank you for showing dignity. There are a few. Okay, fair enough.
Indeed, any other virtue.
Yeah, right. No, and I think this gets to the heart of how we think about the selection problem, because I think that James says that these are kind of research-based, kind of evidence-based, or at least that he's studied across multiple cultures. Where does zest ever actually come up in any religion? I mean, zest is such an Americanized phrase. It's such a specific thing to American culture. I mean, for me, that's kind of what comes out of a lemon when you have pancakes. That is not a character trait. I guess what they mean is enthusiasm. But that's a kind of British perspective on it. So I doubt that these character traits really are that research-based. On the assessment question, I think that it's a bigger problem than James has kind of acknowledged. I think that the central paradox is that this stuff is meaningful, but it's very, very hard to measure it. And as soon as you begin to work out how you measure it, then it becomes less and less meaningful. And that is the kind of central paradox that I think that character curriculum designers are yet to confront. I think that when I asked James, when James is thinking about how to kind of evaluate it instead of measuring it or quantifying it, he talks about using kind of descriptions of pupils and how they evolve and change over time, which seems plausible until you think about it from a teacher's point of view. Which secondary school teacher teaching 300 pupils has the time even to enter kind of 1,200 different judgments every half term on the 300 kids that they teach, let alone writing a description for all of those 300 kids that they only see 1 hour a week. From a teacher workload perspective, that just isn't going to fly. Maybe in primary school it's a bit easier because you only have 30 kids, but for secondary school teachers, I think that's a really, really tough assignment. But I do think there's an alternative. This isn't just a kind of a prophecy of doom that this is never going to work, because I think the alternative is very simple, and that's that habits eat character for breakfast. I think that habits are a far better way, a far better fulcrum for actually helping our kids to achieve. And there's a couple of kind of anecdotes that I think help explain that. At the end of the first year of Michaela, a cleaning lady came round and she saw the kids kind of transitioning between corridors, and she said, "I've never seen pupils so quiet. I've never seen pupils so happy." And she couldn't believe it. And she wasn't saying this to me. She was just kind of expressing her surprise at this. And she said, you know the sign of a good school. The sign of a good school is when there's no chewing gum stuck under all the tables. And she said there's none at Michaela, but obviously it's not necessarily a fair test because there's only one year group that we had. But I worked at a school where they had the kind of £20 million Building Schools for the Future programme. And after the first year, literally within the first term, there was chewing gum under all the desks. And I think that you can kind of tell the difference that a programme of character into lessons isn't going to make such a big difference as thinking really carefully about habits, having staff think really carefully about their interactions with pupils. It's everyday interactions, it's moment-by-moment interactions that actually help kids improve. It's not a one-off lesson that's kind of shoehorned into the curriculum. I was talking to a pupil over lunch the other day. Her name was Janelle, and I said, how have you changed since primary school? And she said, well, at primary school, to be honest, I was very rude. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, actually, there was one time I did stuff that I'm not really proud of. There was one time I actually hit a teacher. And so she hit a teacher, and she said, I said, okay, well, what's different? She said, I couldn't imagine doing that now. It's just totally unthinkable. And so I said, why? And she said, well, to be honest, the teachers in primary school allowed it. They allowed us to be very rude, whereas the teachers at secondary school don't allow it. They don't allow us to be rude. And so, I've been working on my politeness, and, I'm just much more polite and more polite to my friends and family than I was before. And I think that what kind of, this is not a kind of unrepresentative. There are lots of pupils who think the same things and who will say the same things. And if you come to family lunch and visit, then you can talk to them. Don't take my word for it, but actually listen to what they say. But I think that I've got a couple of examples here where some pupils have said similar things. One said, in primary school, I always used to overreact and backchat and complain when getting into trouble. Now at Michaela, I've learned to stay calm and take responsibility. Another one said, I've learned to control my anger. Another pupil said, since I left primary, I've become much kinder at helping pupils, helping teachers, and even at home. And another one said, Michaela has made me into a much kinder person, even to my sisters, even to my parents. And I think that's when you're getting some really great spillover effects from the habits that you build in school to habits that they then have at home. And I think that's where it gets really exciting. So I would say habits, eat character for breakfast. If you really want kids to help improve, focus on the habits. That's the kind of means that will really help them improve their characters.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, once again, we're going to go to the floor for 3 questions.
Thank you. I want to start with the last question first. Is character the only constant? No. I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on that, partly because there's so much else that's constant, that's just as relevant to the 21st century. Algebra, for coding, there's so much literature that will not be kind of out of date in 10 years' time or 20 years' time or 100 years' time. There's so much that we teach in our subjects, and I think we need to kind of reclaim our subject kind of authority and say, yeah, stand up for subjects. Subjects are one of the best ways we can actually ensure that they succeed for the 21st century. But let's speak afterwards if that doesn't answer your question fully. A lovely question from Jess about, do we need space for reflection? I would say yes, we do. I would say no, that's not in lesson time. What we do at Michaela is we have family lunch, and we'll pose a kind of a question. It might be a moral dilemma. It might be, a question where you're wrestling with very complex arguments, and you discuss it over lunch. You discuss it with an adult, you discuss it with other pupils, and that's a really great space to reflect. But I would say that you wouldn't want the opportunity cost of taking a history lesson or an English lesson or a maths lesson away from our pupils who so desperately need that time to really focus and improve at what they're studying. And lastly, I think this is one of the toughest questions to anybody who's going to vote anti-character curriculum. What about this question of deliberate practice? If that goes for subjects, why doesn't that go for character? It's a great question. And I would say that deliberate practice is important. I would say the way to do that is not to have a lesson on it, because you're not genuinely practicing your character trait within that lesson. It's when it gets tough that it's actually important. It's in the confrontational conversation between a teacher and an adult in the corridors, or in the playground, or when they've made a choice where they've chosen to lie, and that's when it really gets tough. Will they recognise that honesty is something that they should be deliberately practicing and something they should be improving on, or is honesty, or are they going to kind of keep up the dishonesty and hope that they avoid trouble? I think that's where it's most important. I wouldn't want to be practicing that in a lesson, a very artificial situation. It's in where the deliberate practice really counts is in those kind of tough conversations between pupils and teachers. So to summarise, we've got 1 minute left, or how long?
We've got 3 minutes.
3 minutes left. So there's quite a long time to summarise.
Start reading out those virtues again.
I've got another 24. No. So I think to summarise, I think probably rather than invective, because I do appreciate that with a free school system you've got really interesting decisions to make over the next few years as to, does the free school movement put character into its curriculum more broadly. The point is that the different free school networks will make different choices on that. And I'm sure, I haven't been to visit any Floriat free schools, free primary schools, but I'm sure that they're doing a great job of combining knowledge and character. Will the opportunity cost kind of argument play out? I mean, that's a question which we'll only be able to see over time, over kind of 10 years or 20 years. It's really a 20-year time horizon that we'll see that happen. So instead of kind of invective, I think probably the best way to end is with an invitation. And, you know, one of the things that I love most about Michaela is that we say to parents when they arrive and we say to guests, come and visit. Speak to the pupils. You know, see how they think about these kind of virtues. If they've just studied Othello, how do they think about honesty and dishonesty? That Iago's duplicity and, you know, Othello's kind of mistrust and trust. That's the stuff that I want them feeling really passionate about. The complexity of character in its full, you know, in its full complexity, rather than just thinking about it in a very kind of abstract way. So I'd invite everybody, you know, and I think, you know, one of the things I most like about working with our head teacher, Catherine, is that she is very welcoming, and even 1 or 2 years in, she's very welcoming to say, come and visit. In fact, hands up if you have visited the Michaela. So yeah, about kind of 40% of the audience have or so. I would say, you know, come and visit, come and speak to the pupils, and I think that's probably, you know, the best case. Be interesting also to ask James whether he extends that same invitation for the Floriat schools, because it's quite a kind of, you know, intimidating thing to open up that invitation, to open up your school, to open up your lessons, and not just take visitors to see the best teachers, but to see, you know, all lessons and how they're playing out, to invite them to lunch and have those conversations. So I'd like to end with that invitation, and, you know, just to kind of summarise what I think the argument is, and why I think it's so important that, you know, this is a very close debate on the numbers. I think it was about 50-50 to start with, so it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out at the end. But I think that, just to kind of summarise my perspective on this, and our perspective at Michaela, is that habits are by far a better way of thinking about these rather than virtues, rather than moral virtues and performance virtues, and breaking out all the different types of virtues. I think that when it really comes down to it, the way to actually help pupils improve is a culture of tough love, being really, really caring and kind of compassionate, but at the very same time having really high standards and sky-high standards that are uncompromising. That's what actually helps pupils to improve, not putting character into timetable lessons. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Now to summarise for his side, James.
Thank you. Just to deal specifically with the questions first. First question from Andrew about psychologists and ethics. I think that is a really good point, actually, because I think that these two can perhaps be jumbled together, and Martin Seligman is a psychologist. It's interesting when I've talked to him about it, because lots of psychologists would shy away from injecting that ethical dimension, and when I talked to him about it, he was very purposeful about the fact that they decided to talk about virtues, because what they found in their research, which, you know, wasn't a sort of, you know, lucky dip of you know, virtues around the world, although they did definitely re-describe them in American terms, that, you know, they found it impossible to separate these concepts from the ethical philosophies in which they were rooted in the various cultures and religions that they were studying. I mean, actually, I would say that the biggest influence on what we do at Floriat comes from the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham, which is very much based around virtue ethics rather than psychology, and indeed theology as well at the Jubilee Centre, although not especially at Floriat. In terms of Plato versus Aristotle, gosh, there's a big argument to fit in 4.5 minutes. Who says you can't teach virtue? Aristotle, of course, says you can, and you know, there you get to the heart, if you like, of the sort of Platonic ideal. This idea of a sort of constant fixed, which we're trying to realise, or we're trying to understand, versus the Aristotelian idea of an unfolding. And we take a very much Aristotelian idea, which of course underpins the whole study of virtue ethics, or the whole subject, if you like, of virtue ethics. And I think this is important differentiator as well from something like philosophy for children, which is all the rage at the moment, which is much more about the Socratic method, which is a sort of constant questioning. I have a big worry about that, because I think if you just ask questions and you don't know about the thing you're asking questions about, you don't learn anything about it. And I think that's also probably at the heart of the idea of the knowledge curriculum. And I don't think it's fair to say this is PSHE light or an alternative. I mean, there's no comment on the value or otherwise of PSHE, but I think this is an entirely different subject. The accountability question is an incredibly good one, and I think you know, I made the case for why I think you can't just look at assessing this in another way, but this opportunity cost question obviously comes up all the time. I think actually in practice what we have to do and what we find that we do is we have to justify it in two ways, what we do. One is that we are doing it for the explicit learning, deliberate practice of character education, but also that it has these ancillary benefits in terms of extending vocabulary, building culture and so on. So it is interesting, if you like, that we have to justify it in those terms. And actually there are ways in which you can get some sense of whether something is happening. For example, you know, you can do knowledge quizzes about terminology and concepts and so on. So there is some way of having accountability, but I certainly would never want schools to be graded on you know, this through longitudinal data or anything else for that matter. I mean, it is worth saying, I mean, I think OFSTED should be abolished for what it's worth, but it is worth saying that OFSTED does judge schools on their social, moral, spiritual and cultural education. So there is a judgment process going on, and my argument is it should be injected with something rigorous and rooted in philosophy rather than something, you know, goodness knows what they judge it on. Just to come back to, so actually I think we're agreed, generally speaking, we're agreed that character is a purpose of education and it should be in every moment of school life in the way that Joe has talked about. And I've spent time here at Michaela at family lunch. It was a really wonderful occasion, and I definitely see that as a character forming opportunity as well as all the other things that go on here. And indeed, Floria is hoping to, we've had agreement to open a school just down the road in Alperton, a primary school. And, you know, it's my hope that one day our pupils will be coming here, because I couldn't think of a better school in the area, or indeed in London, that I would want them to come to. So there is a very close alignment, I think, in lots of things. What we would come down to is this thing is, should it be taught in the curriculum? And the reason I think it should be taught in the curriculum is because actually the habits that Joe wants to create cannot just be magicked out of anywhere. They need to be practiced, as the nature of habits, but also there needs to be some thinking and reflection about them, or else it is just, it is an unthinking habit. And there needs to be opportunity to think and reflect. And the question is where that comes. And I think that that can come through a small portion of the curriculum, particularly if you have a longer day, set aside to the understanding of the concepts that understand the habits that we are trying to inculcate in children as part of their character development. There is no risk, I don't think, when I look at what we're doing, although Joe says, you know, it remains to be seen, there is no risk of it sacrificing other things, literacy, numeracy, whatever. I think it will enhance them, and it already is doing so. And it is that final piece in the jigsaw which really unlocks the total capacity of schools to develop character in the way that we want. Thank you.